In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where every gesture carries weight and every glance holds meaning, some moments become etched in history forever. What happened on that quiet Tuesday afternoon in the private drawing room wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed, and certainly wasn't expected. When King Charles III, in a moment of raw human emotion, reached past his wife Camilla and extended his trembling hand toward his daughter-in-law Kate, the very air seemed to freeze. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of unspoken truths, buried grief, and a family's struggle to heal wounds that had festered for decades. In that single gesture, years of careful protocol crumbled, revealing the beating heart beneath the crown. This is the story of what led to that moment, what it meant, and how it changed the royal family forever. It's a story about loss, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways love can emerge from the deepest pain. Some say it was the day the monarchy showed its humanity. Others call it the moment Diana's spirit finally found peace. But for Charles, Kate, and everyone who witnessed it, it was simply the day when being human mattered more than being royal. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III walked slowly through the corridors that had witnessed generations of royal history. His footsteps echoed softly against the walls adorned with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow his every movement. At 75, Charles carried himself with the dignity expected of a monarch, but those closest to him could see the weight he bore, not just of the crown, but of memories that refused to fade. It had been nearly 6 months since his coronation, and the responsibilities of kingship sat heavily upon his shoulders. The transition from heir to sovereign had not been the smooth passage many had expected. Public opinion remained divided, and the shadow of his beloved mother, Queen Elizabeth II, loomed large over every decision he made. But it wasn't the political pressures or constitutional duties that kept him awake at night. It was the ghost of Diana, and the guilt that had haunted him for over 25 years. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the palace's private physician, had been growing increasingly concerned about Charles's health. She had noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, the dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal during public appearances, and the distant look that would sometimes cross his face during important meetings. The stress of kingship was taking its toll, but Sarah suspected there was something deeper at play. "Your Majesty," she had said during their last consultation, "the human body has limits, even royal ones. You're carrying a burden that's affecting your physical well-being." Charles had simply nodded, his eyes focused on a point beyond the window, beyond the manicured gardens, beyond the present moment entirely. The palace staff had begun to whisper among themselves. Margaret Thompson, Charles's longtime private secretary, noticed how he would sometimes pause outside certain rooms, particularly the blue drawing room where family photographs were displayed. She had served the royal family for over 30 years and had seen Charles through his darkest hours, the divorce, Diana's death, the years of public scrutiny that followed. But there was something different about his demeanor now, something that spoke of unresolved grief finally, demanding attention. Queen Camilla watched her husband with growing concern. She had stood by his side through decades of controversy and criticism, understanding better than anyone the complex web of emotions that surrounded his relationship with his late first wife. Camilla's own journey from public enemy to accepted queen consort had been long and difficult, marked by patient endurance and quiet dignity. She loved Charles deeply, but she also understood that some wounds in the human heart never fully heal. They simply learn to coexist with daily life. During their private moments together, when the cameras were off and the public duties set aside, Camilla would sometimes catch Charles staring into space, lost in thoughts he rarely shared. She had learned not to press him on these occasions, understanding that his relationship with Diana's memory was sacred ground that she could never fully enter. Yet she worried about the toll this internal struggle was taking on his health and happiness. The palace walls seemed to hold memories like a sponge holds water. In the Queen's private study, where Charles now conducted much of his official business, a small silver-framed photograph sat on the desk, not of Camilla, as many might expect, but of his 3 grandchildren, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. The children's faces smiled up at him during long days of constitutional reviews and diplomatic correspondence, reminding him of the future he was helping to shape. It was Prince William and Catherine's marriage that had begun to heal some of the fractures in Charles's heart. Watching his eldest son find genuine happiness with a woman who seemed to embody many of Diana's best qualities, her warmth, her dedication to charitable causes, her natural way with children, had stirred emotions in Charles that he struggled to understand. Kate's grace under pressure, her ability to connect with people from all walks of life, and her obvious devotion to family reminded him so powerfully of Diana that sometimes he had to leave the room to compose himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. The daughter-in-law he had barely known when she first entered the family had become, in many ways, the living embodiment of everything he had loved about Diana. But, where his relationship with his late first wife had been complicated by duty, tradition, and the incompatible desires of two very different people, his relationship with Kate was simple, warm, and uncomplicated by romantic history. Charles found himself looking forward to family gatherings in a way he hadn't since Diana's death. Kate had a gift for making him laugh, for drawing him into conversations about art, history, and photography that reminded him of his own passions. She listened when he spoke about his environmental concerns with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Most importantly, she never seemed intimidated by his position or the weight of royal protocol. During one particularly memorable afternoon at Highgrove, Charles's beloved country estate, Kate had brought the children to see the organic gardens he had spent decades cultivating. As he watched her kneel in the dirt beside Princess Charlotte, helping his granddaughter plant sunflower seeds while explaining the importance of caring for the earth, Charles felt something shift inside his chest. It was as if Diana herself was there in the garden, smiling at the scene unfolding before them. The connection between Charles and Kate had not gone unnoticed by the palace staff or the royal family members. Prince William often remarked to his friends how much his father had changed since Kate joined the family, becoming more relaxed and genuinely happy during family occasions. Even the Queen, in her final years, had commented privately to her lady-in-waiting that Charles seemed to have found a kind of peace in his relationship with Catherine that she hadn't seen since his youth. But, with this growing closeness came an unexpected complication. Charles found himself thinking about Diana more often, not with the sharp pain of loss that had characterized the first decade after her death, but with a bittersweet longing for what might have been. Watching Kate navigate royal duties with such natural grace made him wonder what Diana might have accomplished had she lived, what kind of grandmother she would have been, what conversations they might have had about their shared love for their children and grandchildren. The media had begun to notice the warm relationship between Charles and his daughter-in-law as well. Royal correspondents wrote about their easy rapport during official engagements, the way Charles would offer Kate his arm during formal processions, and the genuine affection that seemed to flow between them. Some commentators noted that Charles appeared more relaxed and animated when Kate was present at events, as if her presence brought out a different side of his personality. Dr. Mitchell had been observing these changes too, and while she was pleased to see Charles finding joy in family relationships, she remained concerned about the underlying emotional turmoil she sensed in her patient. During their sessions, she had begun to probe gently about his relationships with family members, trying to understand the source of both his happiness and his continuing distress. Family relationships can be complicated, Your Majesty, she had said during one consultation. Sometimes the people who bring us the greatest joy also remind us of our deepest sorrows. Charles had looked at her sharply then, as if she had touched on something he had been trying to avoid examining too closely. The truth was that Charles's growing affection for Kate was forcing him to confront feelings about Diana that he had buried for decades. Every time Kate smiled at one of his jokes, every time she showed genuine interest in his work, every time she demonstrated the same natural warmth with strangers that Diana had possessed, Charles felt the weight of roads not taken and words left unsaid. Queen Camilla, with her characteristic wisdom and emotional intelligence, had begun to understand the complex dynamics at play. She loved her husband enough to recognize that his healing process might involve acknowledging truths that were difficult for her to hear. The ghost of Diana had always been present in their marriage, but now it seemed to be taking on a different form, less threatening, perhaps, but no less powerful. As the weeks passed, palace staff noticed that Charles had begun spending more time in the rooms where Diana's memory was most present. He would linger in the picture galleries, studying photographs from William and Harry's childhood, his face wearing an expression that was equal parts regret and wonder. Margaret Thompson found him one evening in the small drawing room, holding a framed photograph of Diana with the young princess, his eyes fixed on his late wife's face with an intensity that spoke of deep, unresolved emotion. The approaching anniversary of Diana's death always brought a change in the palace atmosphere, but this year felt different. Charles seemed more affected than usual, more withdrawn despite his outward efforts to maintain his royal composure. The combination of his new responsibilities as king and his evolving relationship with Kate appeared to be stirring emotions that he had long kept carefully controlled. Dr. Mitchell scheduled more frequent checkups, concerned about the physical manifestations of Charles's emotional state. His blood pressure had been elevated, his sleep patterns disrupted, and she noticed a tremor in his hands that seemed to worsen during times of stress. When she suggested that emotional counseling might be beneficial, Charles had given her a look that was both grateful and terrified. Some conversations, he had said quietly, require more courage than facing a hostile parliament or an angry mob. Some truths are easier to live with when they remain unexamined. But Dr. Mitchell could see in his eyes that the time for avoiding those conversations was running out. The weight of unspoken truths was becoming too heavy for even a king to carry alone. The stage was being set for something that no one could have predicted, a moment when the careful boundaries between past and present, between duty and emotion, between what was and what might have been, would collapse entirely. In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, among the portraits of long-dead monarchs and the weight of centuries of tradition, a very human drama was about to unfold that would change everything. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat in the morning room reviewing her schedule for the upcoming week. The soft lighting cast a warm glow over the antique furniture and family photographs that dotted the side tables, creating an atmosphere of comfortable intimacy that belied the grandeur of the surroundings. Kate had always preferred this room for its relative simplicity and the way the natural light filtered through the ancient glass, making everything seem softer somehow. At 41, Kate had grown into her role as a senior member of the royal family with remarkable grace. The nervous young woman who had once been photographed fleeing paparazzi cameras had evolved into a confident princess who could handle state dinners and charity galas with equal ease. But those who knew her best understood that beneath the polished public persona lived a woman of deep sensitivity and emotional intelligence, qualities that had not gone unnoticed by her father-in-law. The relationship between Kate and Charles had developed slowly over the years, built on shared interests and mutual respect rather than the sometimes forced familiarity that often characterized royal family interactions. Kate genuinely enjoyed the king's company, finding him far more intellectually curious and emotionally complex than the public persona suggested. Their conversations about art, literature, and environmental issues revealed a man of considerable depth and passion, qualities that resonated with Kate's own interests and values. What Kate hadn't fully realized was how much her presence in the family had affected Charles on a deeper, more personal level. She noticed that he seemed more relaxed during family gatherings when she was present, more willing to share stories about his own children's youth, more open about his hopes and concerns for the future of the monarchy. But she attributed this to the natural evolution of their relationship rather than anything more complex. Recently, however, Kate had begun to sense something different in Charles's demeanor. During their last family dinner at Clarence's house, she had caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not inappropriate, certainly, but intense in a way that made her slightly uncomfortable. It was as if he was seeing something in her that she herself wasn't aware of, as if she represented something significant that went beyond her role as William's wife and the mother of his grandchildren. Prince William had noticed the change in his father as well, though he interpreted it differently than his wife might have. William saw his father's growing warmth toward Kate as a sign of healing, an indication that Charles was finally allowing himself to form meaningful family bonds without the complicated emotional baggage that had characterized so many of his relationships. William remembered the distant, duty-bound father of his youth and was grateful to see Charles embracing his role as grandfather and father-in-law with genuine enthusiasm. But William was also protective of his wife and sensitive to any dynamics that might put her in an uncomfortable position. The royal family had a long history of complicated relationships, and William was determined to shield Kate from the kind of emotional turmoil that had devastated his mother. When Kate mentioned Charles's increasingly frequent invitations for private conversations about family matters and royal duties, William felt a slight stirring of concern. "He's just trying to prepare you for increased responsibilities," William had reassured her after Kate expressed some confusion about Charles's request that she join him for private briefings about several high-profile, charitable organizations. Father has always believed in thorough preparation, and he sees how naturally you handle public engagements. He probably wants to share some of his experience with you. Kate had accepted this explanation, but something in her intuition suggested there was more to Charles's behavior than simple mentorship. During their last private meeting, when Charles had been explaining the historical significance of various royal patronages, she had noticed tears forming in his eyes as he spoke about the importance of continuing Diana's work with homeless charities. The emotion had seemed to surprise Charles himself, and he had quickly turned away to compose himself, but not before Kate saw the depth of pain that still lived within him. Queen Camilla had her own perspective on the evolving dynamics within the family. She had watched her husband's relationship with Kate develop with a mixture of warmth and concern. Camilla genuinely liked and respected Kate, appreciating her steadiness and the happiness she brought to William and the children. But Camilla was also acutely aware of how Kate's presence seemed to stir memories and emotions in Charles that he struggled to process. During their private moments together, Charles had begun talking about Diana more frequently, not in the bitter or resentful way that had characterized the years immediately following their divorce, but with a kind of wistful regret that Camilla found both touching and troubling. He spoke of Diana's dedication to her charitable work, her natural ability to connect with people who were suffering, and her fierce love for their sons. More concerning to Camilla was the way Charles seemed to be projecting some of these qualities onto Kate, as if he was seeing his late first wife's spirit living on through his daughter-in-law. She has Diana's gift for making people feel seen, Charles had said one evening as they watched news coverage of Kate's visit to a children's hospital. The way she kneels down to speak to the children, the way she listens, really listens, when people share their stories. It's exactly what Diana used to do. Camilla had nodded carefully, understanding that this comparison was both a compliment to Kate and a sign of Charles's continuing struggle with unresolved grief. She loved her husband enough to recognize that his healing process might involve confronting emotions that had been buried for decades, but she also worried about where this emotional journey might lead them all. The palace staff had begun to notice subtle changes in the household routine. Margaret Thompson observed that Charles had started asking for Kate to be included in more family briefings and private meetings, often on matters that might normally have been handled by William alone. The king's interest in Kate's schedule and well-being seemed to go beyond the usual concern of a father-in-law, taking on an almost protective quality that reminded some longtime staff members of how Charles had once been with Diana. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had her own concerns about Charles's emotional state. During their regular consultations, she had noticed that Charles seemed more agitated when discussing family matters, particularly anything involving Kate's public duties or media coverage. His blood pressure readings had been inconsistent, often spiking during weeks when Kate had high-profile engagements or when media coverage compared her favorably to Diana. Stress manifests differently in different people, Your Majesty, Dr. Mitchell had explained during their last session. Sometimes the things that bring us joy can also trigger complex emotional responses, especially when they connect to unresolved experiences from our past. Charles had looked at her with a mixture of understanding and frustration. Are you suggesting that my affection for my daughter-in-law is somehow unhealthy, Doctor? Not unhealthy, sir, but perhaps more complicated than it appears on the surface. Family relationships often carry layers of meaning that we don't fully recognize ourselves. It might be beneficial to explore what Kate's presence in your life represents to you, beyond the obvious family connection. The conversation had left Charles feeling exposed and defensive, but also strangely relieved. For months he had been struggling with emotions that he didn't fully understand, feelings that seemed to blur the boundaries between past and present, between love for Diana and affection for Kate. Dr. Mitchell's gentle probing had forced him to acknowledge that his relationship with Kate was stirring something deeper than simple familial warmth. Kate herself had begun to sense the undercurrents of emotions swirling around her interactions with Charles. She noticed how his eyes would linger on her face during family conversations, how he seemed to hang on her words when she spoke about her charitable work, how he would sometimes reach out as if to touch her arm before catching himself and pulling back. None of these gestures were inappropriate, but they carried an emotional intensity that made Kate slightly uncomfortable. During a recent charity gala, Kate had watched Charles from across the room as he spoke with guests about her work with early childhood development. His pride in her accomplishments was evident. But there was something else in his expression, a kind of wistful satisfaction that seemed out of proportion to the normal pride of a father-in-law. When their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, Charles had smiled at her with such warmth and something approaching gratitude that Kate felt a flutter of confusion. The media had begun to pick up on the special relationship between Charles and Kate as well. Royal correspondents wrote about their easy rapport during public engagements, noting how Charles seemed to defer to Kate's opinions on certain matters and how protective he appeared to be of her during potentially uncomfortable situations. Some commentators began to suggest that Kate had become Charles's favorite family member, the daughter he had never had. Prince Harry, watching these developments from his home in California, had his own complex feelings about his father's growing closeness to Kate. Harry had always been fond of his sister-in-law, appreciating her kindness to him during some of the most difficult periods of his life. But he also understood better than most how his father's emotional patterns could become overwhelming for those around him. During one of his rare phone conversations with William, Harry had mentioned his observations about Charles's behavior. "Dad seems really invested in Kate's success," Harry had said carefully. "Maybe more invested than he needs to be. I just want to make sure she's comfortable with all the attention." William had bristled slightly at the suggestion that there was anything concerning about his father's relationship with Kate. "Father is finally showing the kind of family warmth that we always wanted from him as children. Kate appreciates his support, and she's perfectly capable of managing her own relationships." But, privately, William was beginning to have his own concerns. He had noticed how his father's mood seemed to fluctuate based on Kate's schedule and public reception. When Kate received positive media coverage, Charles was noticeably happier and more energetic. When she faced criticism or challenging situations, Charles became protective and sometimes irritable with his staff. It was as if Kate's well-being had become tied to Charles's own emotional equilibrium in a way that seemed potentially unhealthy for everyone involved. The autumn season brought with it a series of events that would test the delicate balance of emotions within the royal family. The anniversary of Diana's death was approaching, always a difficult time for Charles, but this year it seemed to affect him more deeply than usual. Palace staff noticed that he spent long periods in rooms where Diana's photographs were displayed, and his sleep patterns became increasingly erratic. Kate found herself thinking more frequently about her role within the family, and the unexpected emotional complexities that seemed to surround her relationship with Charles. She loved being part of the royal family, and genuinely cared for Charles as a father-in-law and as a person, but she was beginning to sense that her presence meant something to him that went beyond the normal bounds of family affection. The stage was being set for an emotional reckoning that no one could have anticipated. In the quiet corridors of the palaces, among the weight of tradition and the careful protocols of royal life, human emotions were building toward a moment of truth that would change everything. Charles's unresolved grief, Kate's intuitive sensitivity, Camilla's worried love, and William's protective instincts were all converging toward a single moment that would strip away pretense and reveal the raw human hearts beating beneath the royal facades. None of them could have known that a simple family gathering would become the catalyst for long-buried truths to finally surface, forever altering the dynamics of the royal family and forcing them all to confront emotions that had been carefully hidden for far too long. The invitation had seemed innocent enough when it arrived on a cream-colored card embossed with the royal cipher. King Charles III requested the pleasure of the Prince and Princess of Wales's company for an intimate family dinner at Buckingham Palace on Tuesday evening. No formal dress code, no official business, simply a quiet evening among family members. William and Kate had accepted graciously, both looking forward to a relaxed evening without the usual pressures of public duties. What they didn't know was that Charles had spent days agonizing over the invitation, wrestling with emotions he could barely name, let alone understand. The approaching anniversary of Diana's death had stirred something deep within him, a need to address feelings and memories that had been carefully compartmentalized for decades. Dr. Mitchell's recent suggestions about exploring his complex emotional responses to family relationships had left him feeling simultaneously enlightened and terrified. Charles found himself unable to sleep the night before the dinner, pacing the floors of his private apartments at Clarence House, while Camilla watched him with growing concern. She had seen him through many difficult periods over the years, but there was something different about his current state of mind, a restless energy that spoke of barely contained emotions seeking an outlet. "Perhaps we should postpone the dinner," Camilla had suggested gently as Charles stood at the window, staring out at the darkened London streets. You seem quite unsettled, darling. Family time should be peaceful, not stressful. Charles had turned to her with eyes that reflected years of accumulated pain and confusion. I need to see her, Camilla. I need to understand what it is about Kate that makes me feel so connected to something I thought I had lost forever. It's not fair to any of us to continue pretending these feelings don't exist. Camilla's heart ached for her husband, understanding that his struggle went far deeper than simple family affection. She had lived with the ghost of Diana for decades, accepting that her marriage to Charles would always exist in the shadow of his first great love. But watching him project aspects of Diana onto Kate felt different somehow, more dangerous to the careful emotional balance they had all worked so hard to maintain. Charles, she had said carefully, Kate is not Diana. She cannot heal wounds that Diana's death left behind, and it's not fair to expect her to carry that burden. I know that, Charles had replied, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that troubled Camilla deeply. I know Kate is her own person, with her own life and her own relationships. But when I see her work with the children, when I watch her navigate the challenges of royal life with such grace, I feel something that I haven't felt since Diana died. It's as if some part of her spirit lives on through Kate, and I need to understand what that means. The day of the dinner dawned gray and drizzly, matching the emotional atmosphere that seemed to permeate the palace. Margaret Thompson noticed that Charles was unusually particular about the arrangements, personally reviewing the seating plan multiple times, and insisting that the meal be served in the smaller blue drawing room rather than the formal dining hall. His Majesty seems quite invested in this evening going well, Margaret mentioned to James Harrison, the longtime butler who had served the royal family through numerous personal crises. He's changed the menu twice and asked for fresh flowers to be arranged 3 times. I haven't seen him this nervous about a family dinner in years. James nodded knowingly. He had observed the growing complexity of Charles's relationship with Kate over recent months, noting how the king's entire demeanor would change when she entered a room. There was an intensity to Charles's attention when Kate was present that reminded James of how Charles had once been with Diana, completely absorbed, hanging on every word, as if afraid that looking away might cause her to disappear. Kate spent the afternoon preparing for the dinner with her usual care, selecting a navy blue dress that was elegant without being ostentatious. She had learned over the years that Charles appreciated understated sophistication, and she wanted the evening to be comfortable for everyone. What she couldn't shake was a growing sense of unease about the dinner, an intuition that suggested this would be more than a simple family gathering. William was running late from a meeting with his private secretary about upcoming royal engagements, leaving Kate to arrive at Buckingham Palace alone. As she was escorted through the familiar corridors by palace staff, she felt the weight of history and expectation that always seemed to press down upon visitors to the ancient building. The portraits of previous monarchs watched her passage with painted eyes that seemed to hold secrets and judgments in equal measure. Charles was waiting for her in the bow room, standing near the window with his back to the door when she entered. He turned as she approached, and Kate was struck by the intensity of his expression, not inappropriate, but filled with an emotion that seemed almost overwhelming. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the ornate room, and Kate felt as if she was seeing something in Charles's eyes that he had never allowed anyone else to witness. "Catherine," he said softly, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her heart flutter with an undefined anxiety. "Thank you for coming this evening. I know your schedule is incredibly demanding." "Of course, Your Majesty," Kate replied, falling back on formal address despite the intimate setting. Something about Charles's demeanor made her feel the need for the protection of protocol. "I always enjoy our family dinners. Where are Camilla and William?" "Camilla is feeling slightly unwell and sends her apologies," Charles said, and Kate noticed a slight tremor in his voice. She thought it best to rest this evening, and William telephoned to say he's been delayed by urgent business. "I hope you don't mind if it's just the 2 of us for a while." Kate felt a flutter of discomfort at this news. While she had dined alone with Charles on previous occasions, something about this evening felt different, charged with an emotional undercurrent that she couldn't identify. But she smiled graciously and allowed herself to be led to the drawing room where their dinner had been laid out on a small table set for 3, though only 2 places would be needed. As they settled into their seats, Charles poured wine with hands that Kate noticed were slightly unsteady. The conversation began normally enough, with discussions about the children's school activities and Kate's upcoming charity engagements. But, as the evening progressed, Kate became increasingly aware of the way Charles was looking at her, not with anything inappropriate, but with an intensity that spoke of emotions far more complex than simple familial affection. "You remind me so much of her sometimes," Charles said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence as they finished their main course. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they startled Kate, and he immediately looked as if he wished he could take them back. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty?" Kate asked carefully, though she suspected she knew exactly who Charles meant. Charles set down his wine glass and looked directly into Kate's eyes. "Diana, you remind me of Diana in ways that I'm only beginning to understand. The way you connect with people, the way you make everyone around you feel valued and heard. Your natural grace, your genuine compassion. It's so much like what she was at her best." Kate felt her cheeks flush, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected comparison. "That's very kind of you to say, but I could never presume to." "No," Charles interrupted gently. "You don't understand. I'm not suggesting you're trying to be like her, or that you're somehow replacing her. But watching you over these years, seeing how naturally you've embraced your role, how much joy you bring to William and the children, it's helped me understand what I lost when Diana died. Not just a wife, though that loss was profound, but a partner in the work that matters most. Someone who understood that being royal isn't about privilege, it's about service." The room seemed to grow smaller around them as Charles continued speaking, his words carrying the weight of years of suppressed emotion. Kate found herself drawn into his pain despite her discomfort, recognizing that she was witnessing something deeply personal and vulnerable. "I failed her, Catherine," Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I failed to appreciate what I had when I had it. I was so bound by duty and tradition and what was expected of me that I couldn't see the extraordinary woman who was trying to build a life with me. And now, watching you navigate the same challenges with such wisdom and grace, I see what might have been possible if I had been a different man." Kate reached across the table instinctively, covering Charles's hand with her own in a gesture of comfort. The moment their skin touched, something electric passed between them. Not romantic attraction, but a deep recognition of shared understanding and mutual pain. Kate suddenly understood that Charles's growing closeness to her wasn't about her personally, but about what she represented, a second chance to appreciate the kind of woman Diana had been. "You can't change the past, Your Majesty," Kate said softly. "And Diana wouldn't want you to torture yourself with regret. She loved you, despite everything that went wrong between you. She would want you to find peace." Charles looked down at their joined hands, tears forming in his eyes. "How do you know what Diana would have wanted?" Kate was quiet for a moment, searching for words that would offer comfort without overstepping boundaries. "Because she loved her sons, and she would want their father to be happy. Because she was a mother, and mothers want healing for their children's families. And because," Kate paused, surprised by her own insight, "because I think part of her spirit does live on, in the way William loves, in the way he parents, in the kindness he shows others." "You didn't fail completely, Charles. Look at the man your son became." The use of his first name in that moment of vulnerability seemed to break something open in Charles. Years of carefully maintained emotional distance, of royal reserve, and protocol-bound interactions crumbled as he allowed himself to be seen in his full human complexity. And Kate, despite her discomfort with the intimacy of the moment, found herself responding to his pain with the same natural compassion that had drawn so many people to her over the years. But neither of them noticed that Queen Camilla had arrived at the palace after all, having decided that her husband needed her support despite feeling unwell. As she approached the drawing room, guided by a concerned staff member who had observed the emotional intensity of the dinner, Camilla could hear Charles's voice through the slightly open door, speaking with more raw honesty than she had heard from him in years. The stage was set for a moment that would change everything, as three people who loved each other in different ways were about to collide in a confrontation that would strip away years of careful emotional protection and force them all to face truths that had been too painful to acknowledge. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the blue drawing room seemed unnaturally loud in the emotionally charged atmosphere. Kate and Charles both heard them approaching, but neither moved to separate their joined hands or shift away from the intimate conversation that had been unfolding between them. Something about the moment felt too important, too fragile, to disturb with concerns about appearances or protocol. When Queen Camilla appeared in the doorway, Her initial expression of concern quickly transformed into something more complex as she took in the scene before her. Charles and Kate sat close together at the small dinner table, their hands touching, their faces reflecting a depth of emotional connection that she had never witnessed between them before. For a moment, time seemed suspended as all three of them processed the implications of what Camilla had discovered. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Camilla said carefully, her voice carrying just a hint of the strain she was feeling. She had learned over the years to navigate the complex emotional landscape of her marriage with grace and diplomacy, but this scene challenged even her considerable emotional intelligence. Charles immediately pulled his hand away from Kate's, his face flushing with what might have been embarrassment or guilt. "Camilla, darling, I thought you were resting. Catherine and I were just having dinner while waiting for William." Kate felt her own cheeks burning as she stood to greet Camilla properly. "Your Majesty, please join us. We've barely started the main course." But even as she spoke the polite words, Kate was acutely aware that Camilla had witnessed something that went far beyond a simple family dinner conversation. Camilla moved into the room with her characteristic poise, accepting Charles's gesture toward the third chair at the table. But her eyes were alert and assessing, taking in the emotional undercurrents that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. She had lived with Charles long enough to recognize when he was in the grip of powerful emotions, and she could see that whatever had been happening before her arrival had affected both him and Kate profoundly. "How are you feeling?" Kate asked with genuine concern, grateful for the opportunity to redirect the conversation towards safer territory. "Charles mentioned you weren't well this evening." "Much better now," Camilla replied, though her eyes remained fixed on her husband's face. "Sometimes a bit of rest makes all the difference." Though I confess I became concerned when the palace staff mentioned that Charles seemed quite emotional this evening. I thought perhaps I should check on things after all. The weight of unspoken understanding settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Charles understood that Camilla knew something significant had been happening. Camilla understood that she had walked into a moment of unusual vulnerability and connection. And Kate understood that she had somehow become the center of a complex emotional dynamic that she had never asked for and didn't fully comprehend. "We were discussing family," Charles said carefully, his voice carrying a note of defensiveness that surprised all of them. "Catherine and I were talking about the children, about royal duties, about—" He paused, seeming to struggle with how much to reveal. "About Diana." The name hung in the air like a challenge. Camilla's expression remained carefully neutral, but Kate could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested deep emotional pain. This was the ghost that had haunted their marriage for decades, the specter of perfect love lost too soon that could never be completely exorcised or replaced. "Diana is part of our family history," Camilla said evenly. "Of course she comes up in family conversations. She was William's mother, the children's grandmother. It's natural that we would discuss her." But Charles shook his head, his face showing the strain of emotions too long suppressed. "It wasn't just that, Camilla, and you know it. Catherine reminds me of her in ways that I'm only beginning to understand. Watching her over these years, seeing how she approaches royal duties with such natural grace and genuine compassion, it's forced me to confront feelings about Diana that I thought I had resolved." Kate felt as if she was drowning in the intensity of the moment. She wanted to excuse herself, to leave Charles and Camilla to work through whatever needed to be discussed between them. But something in Charles's expression told her that her presence was essential to whatever was happening. "Charles," Camilla said gently, "we've talked about this. Your feelings about Diana, your regrets about your first marriage, they're understandable, but they're also in the past. Catherine is a wonderful addition to our family, but she can't heal wounds that Diana's death created." "But what if she can?" Charles asked, and his voice carried a desperation that made both women's hearts ache. "What if seeing Catherine embrace royal life with such natural ability is helping me understand what I failed to appreciate about Diana? What if this is some kind of second chance to honor what Diana represented?" Kate found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to intervene. "Your Majesty, Charles, I'm honored by the comparison, but I can't be responsible for healing your relationship with Diana's memory. That's something you have to do for yourself." Charles looked at her with eyes that reflected years of accumulated pain and regret. "But don't you see, Catherine? You've already helped more than you know. Watching you navigate the challenges that destroyed my first marriage with such wisdom and grace has shown me what might have been possible. You've given me a glimpse of the partnership that Diana and I might have had if I had been mature enough to appreciate it." The room fell silent as the weight of Charles's words settled over them. Camilla stared at her husband with an expression that combined love, hurt, and resignation. Kate felt overwhelmed by the responsibility that Charles seemed to be placing on her shoulders. And Charles himself seemed simultaneously relieved to have finally spoken his truth and terrified of the consequences. It was then that Prince William arrived, his footsteps echoing in the corridor as he approached the drawing room. He entered with apologies for his lateness on his lips, but the words died as he took in the scene before him. His wife, his father, and his stepmother sat around a small table in what was clearly the aftermath of an intensely emotional conversation. The atmosphere in the room was so charged that William felt it immediately. "Is everything all right?" William asked, his protective instincts immediately activated by Kate's obvious distress. "Kate, you look upset." "We were discussing your mother," Charles said before Kate could respond. "I was telling Catherine how much she reminds me of Diana in the best possible ways." William's expression darkened slightly as he understood the implications of what his father was saying. He had watched his parents' marriage disintegrate, had lived through the aftermath of Diana's death, and had seen how the weight of unresolved grief and guilt had affected Charles for decades. The last thing he wanted was for Kate to become entangled in that emotional complexity. "Father," William said carefully, moving to stand behind Kate's chair in a gesture of obvious protection, "I hope you're not putting Kate in the position of having to carry your feelings about Mother. That wouldn't be fair to anyone." Charles looked up at his son with eyes that reflected both love and pain. "I would never ask Catherine to be anything other than herself, William. But surely you can see the similarities? The way she connects with people, the natural compassion, the dedication to service." "Mother was unique," William interrupted firmly. "Kate is unique. They're both extraordinary women, but they're not the same person, and Kate shouldn't have to live in Mother's shadow or carry the burden of your unresolved feelings." The confrontation that had been building for months was finally erupting, with years of carefully suppressed emotions spilling into the open. Charles felt exposed and defensive. Camilla felt hurt and protective of her marriage. Kate felt overwhelmed and used, and William felt angry on behalf of both his wife and his deceased mother. But it was in this moment of maximum tension that something unexpected happened. Charles, overwhelmed by the intensity of his emotions and the realization of how his behavior had affected the people he loved most, reached out instinctively for comfort and support. His hand, trembling with emotion, extended not toward his wife Camilla, who sat closest to him, but toward Kate, who represented something he couldn't fully name or understand. The gesture was automatic, unthinking, driven by an emotional need that bypassed rational thought. In that moment, Charles wasn't thinking about protocol or appearances or the feelings of others. He was simply a man in pain, reaching for the person who had somehow become associated in his mind with healing and forgiveness. Kate saw his hand extending toward her and felt frozen with shock and confusion. She understood instinctively that this gesture, innocent though it might be, would change everything. The emotional undercurrents that had been building for months were crystallizing into a moment that would force them all to confront truths that had been too painful to acknowledge. The room held its breath as Charles's hand hung in the air between them, a bridge across years of pain and regret, a plea for understanding and connection that transcended the normal boundaries of family relationships. In that suspended moment, everyone present understood that whatever happened next would alter the dynamics of the royal family forever. Time seemed to slow as they all processed the magnitude of what was occurring. This was more than just a family disagreement or a moment of emotional vulnerability. This was a reckoning with the ghosts of the past and the complicated realities of love, loss, and the human need for connection and forgiveness. The silence that followed was not empty but full of unspoken truths, buried emotions, and the weight of decisions that would echo through their lives for years to come. In the elegant drawing room of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, a very human drama was reaching its climax, and none of them would ever be quite the same again. The silence that followed Charles's outstretched hand seemed to last forever, though it was probably only seconds. In that frozen moment, Kate could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the intensity of emotions too complex for words, and the sense that whatever she did next would ripple through their family for years to come. She looked at Charles's trembling hand, then at his face, where she saw not romantic longing or inappropriate desire, but something far more heartbreaking: a father and grandfather desperately seeking absolution for failures he could never fully repair. Instead of taking his hand, Kate did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She stood slowly, moved around the table, and gently placed both of her hands on Charles's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes with the same compassionate clarity she brought to her work with grief counseling and family support. "Charles," she said softly, using his name with deliberate intention, "Diana forgives you. She forgave you a long time ago. The question is whether you can forgive yourself." The words seemed to break something fundamental inside Charles. Years of carefully maintained royal composure crumbled as he began to weep. Not the controlled tears of public grief, but the raw, ugly crying of a man finally confronting the depths of his own guilt and regret. His whole body shook with the force of emotions that had been imprisoned for decades, and Kate felt the vibrations through her hands on his shoulders. William moved instinctively toward his father, his anger dissolving in the face of such profound human pain. Whatever complications existed around Charles's feelings for Kate, William could see that his father was finally experiencing something he had needed for 27 years, a moment of genuine forgiveness and release. Queen Camilla watched her husband's breakdown with tears in her own eyes, understanding that this emotional catharsis was necessary for Charles's healing, even if it was painful for her to witness. She had loved this complicated man for decades, accepting that part of his heart would always belong to Diana. But seeing him finally begin to process his grief in a healthy way gave her hope that their marriage might finally be free from the ghost that had haunted it for so long. "She loved you," Kate continued, her voice steady despite the emotional chaos around her. "Diana loved you enough to give you two beautiful sons who have grown into extraordinary men. She loved you enough to support your environmental work even when your marriage was failing. She loved you enough to want you to be happy, even if that happiness couldn't be with her." Charles looked up at Kate through his tears, and she could see something shifting in his eyes, not the desperate reaching for impossible healing, but the beginning of genuine acceptance. "How can you be so certain about what Diana would have wanted?" Kate smiled through her own tears, thinking of conversations with William about his mother's hopes and dreams. Because she was a mother who loved her children above all else. And a mother's greatest wish is for her children to have a father who is at peace with himself. Your happiness was always part of her prayers, Charles, even when she couldn't be the one to provide it. The room felt different now, as if a storm had passed and left the air cleaner somehow. Charles's breakdown had released a pressure that had been building for decades, and everyone present could feel the subtle shift in emotional dynamics. This wasn't the end of complicated family relationships or the resolution of all past hurts, but it was a beginning, a foundation upon which healthier connections could be built. William approached his father and placed a gentle hand on his back. "Father, Kate is right. Mother would want you to find peace. She would want all of us to find a way to honor her memory without being imprisoned by it." Camilla rose from her chair and moved to stand beside her husband, her own hand joining William's on Charles's back. "Darling, you've carried this burden alone for far too long. We're your family, all of us, and we want to help you heal." Kate stepped back slightly, giving the family space to embrace while remaining close enough to offer continued support. She understood now that Charles's growing attachment to her had never really been about her personally, but about what she represented in his emotional landscape. A second chance to appreciate the kind of woman Diana had been, a living reminder that love and service could coexist, a bridge between the past he regretted and the future he still hoped to shape. "I'm sorry," Charles said, his voice hoarse from emotion. "Catherine, I'm so sorry for putting you in such an impossible position. My feelings, my memories, my regrets, none of that should have become your burden to carry." Kate knelt beside Charles's chair, taking his hands in hers with genuine warmth. "You didn't burden me, Charles. You honored me by trusting me with your pain. And you honored Diana by finally allowing yourself to grieve properly for what you both lost." The conversation that followed was unlike any the royal family had ever shared, raw, honest, and free from the usual constraints of protocol and emotional reserve. Charles spoke about his regrets regarding his first marriage, his guilt over Diana's death, and his fear that he had failed as both a husband and a father. William shared his own struggle to forgive his father while honoring his mother's memory. Camilla talked about the challenge of loving a man whose heart was partially claimed by a ghost, and Kate revealed how she had sometimes felt the weight of unspoken expectations to be something she could never be. As the evening wore on, they began to find their way toward a new understanding of their family dynamics. Charles's attachment to Kate could be acknowledged and appreciated without becoming destructive or inappropriate. Kate's resemblance to Diana could be celebrated as a gift rather than a burden. Camilla's position as Charles's wife could be secure without requiring the erasure of his first love. And William could honor both his mother's memory and his father's need for healing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, when she heard about the evening's events from Margaret Thompson, who had been discreetly informed by palace staff, was not surprised by what had transpired. She had sensed for months that Charles was building towards some kind of emotional crisis or breakthrough. The fact that it had happened in the presence of his family, surrounded by people who loved him, seemed like the best possible outcome. Sometimes, she explained to Margaret during one of their informal conversations about the royal family's well-being, the human psyche creates exactly the circumstances it needs for healing. His Majesty's growing closeness to the Princess of Wales may have seemed concerning, but it was actually his mind's way of creating a safe space to finally process his grief about Princess Diana. The weeks following that emotional dinner saw subtle but significant changes in the royal family's dynamics. Charles seemed lighter somehow, more present during family gatherings, and less prone to the melancholy moods that had characterized him for so many years. His relationship with Kate remained warm and close, but it was now grounded in healthy family affection rather than the complicated projection of unresolved emotions. Camilla noticed the change in her husband most clearly. For the first time in their marriage, she felt that Charles was fully present with her, unburdened by the weight of guilt and regret that had shadowed their relationship for decades. Their conversations became deeper and more intimate as Charles finally felt free to discuss Diana without the shame that had previously made such discussions painful for both of them. William and Kate found their own relationship strengthened by the family's newfound emotional honesty. The crisis had forced them all to confront uncomfortable truths, but it had also demonstrated the depth of love and commitment that bound them together. Kate no longer felt the pressure of unspoken expectations, and William no longer worried about protecting her from his father's complicated emotions. The media never learned the full details of what happened that evening, though royal correspondents noted that the family seemed more relaxed and genuinely happy during subsequent public appearances. Some commentators observed that King Charles appeared more confident and settled in his role, while others remarked on the obvious warmth and mutual respect that characterized his interactions with all family members. Prince Harry, when he learned about the evening from William during one of their increasingly frequent phone conversations, felt a complex mixture of emotions. He was glad that his father had finally found a way to process his grief about their mother, but he also felt the familiar ache of being physically distant from family moments that might have helped his own healing process. Maybe this is what Mother would have wanted all along, Harry said to William during one of their calls. For Father to finally forgive himself so he could be the parent and grandfather she always hoped he would be. The anniversary of Diana's death that year was observed differently by the royal family. Instead of the usual separate private commemorations marked by individual grief and regret, they gathered together at Kensington Palace to share memories and stories about Diana's life and legacy. Charles spoke openly about his former wife's extraordinary qualities and his own failures, while Kate shared how Diana's example had inspired her own approach to royal duties. It was during this gathering that Charles made a gesture that captured the healing that had taken place within the family. He presented Kate with a piece of Diana's jewelry, not the famous engagement ring that William had given her, but a simple pearl bracelet that Diana had worn frequently during her charitable work. "Diana would have wanted you to have this," Charles said as he fastened the bracelet around Kate's wrist. She believed that jewelry should be worn by women who would honor its history while creating their own legacy. You embody everything she hoped the royal family could become: compassionate, accessible, and genuinely dedicated to service. This time, when Charles reached for Kate, it was with the clear intention of family affection and mutual respect. The gesture was witnessed by everyone present and received with joy rather than confusion. The complicated emotions that had once threatened to destabilize their family relationships had been transformed into a deeper understanding and appreciation for the bonds that connected them all. As the seasons turned and the royal family settled into their new emotional equilibrium, It became clear that the evening of revelation had marked a turning point not just for Charles personally, but for the monarchy itself. An institution that had often struggled to balance tradition with human emotion had found a way to honor both, creating space for genuine healing while maintaining the dignity and continuity that defined the royal family's public role. The silence that had once felt so threatening in that drawing room had given way to honest conversation, mutual support, and the kind of family love that transcends titles and protocol. Charles had found his peace with Diana's memory. Kate had claimed her own space within the family narrative. Camilla had secured her position as both wife and queen, and William had witnessed his father's transformation into the man he had always hoped he could become. In the end, it was love, complicated, messy, sometimes painful, but ultimately healing love, that had saved them all. And in the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where the portraits of long-dead monarchs continued their eternal vigil, the current royal family had learned that being human was not a weakness to be hidden, but a strength to be celebrated and shared.